So hello and welcome to our first installment of People of Participedia, an interview series where we sit down with individuals in the Participedia network and do a deep dive into recent projects they are working on or events they are involved in related to public participation and democratic innovation. My name is Jennifer Wallace. I am a research assistant with Participedia, and I am speaking to you today from the lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, lands governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement in what is currently called Canada. With me here today is Dr. Bonny Ibhawoh, Director of Participedia, who is here to share his experiences at both the most recent session of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development in Geneva and his involvement in the Global Citizens Assembly's People's Declaration for the Sustainable Future of Planet Earth, presented at the 2021 UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. Dr. Ibhawoh is the principal investigator leading our international network of researchers, educators, practitioners, and policymakers through phase 2 of the Participedia project. In addition to spearheading our efforts at Participedia, Dr. Ibhawoh is also an expert with the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development. He is the director of the McMaster Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice, project director of the Confronting Atrocity project, and is, of course, a professor of human rights history and African history at McMaster University. So welcome, Dr. Ibhawoh, and thank you for taking the time to sit down with me today and share some of your recent experiences.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.
So we will start with your policy report, Racism, Racial Discrimination, and the Right to Development, which you presented to the UN Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development in Geneva this November. Could you offer us a brief overview of the study?
Yes, so thank you again, Jennifer. So the study was undertaken under the auspices of the Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development, where I'm an independent expert. And the goal of the study is to examine racism and racial discrimination as obstacles to the operationalization of the right to development. So the right to development is one of the United Nations mandated human rights. It's founded on the Declaration on the Right to Development. And it really centers on the right of everyone to participate in and benefit from the fruits of development, people-centered development. So the study was really to see how questions of racial discrimination and racism kind of work against the achievement of those stated goals in the declaration. And the ultimate aim is to provide states and other stakeholders with evidence-based tools on how to address these challenges and obstacles that racism poses to the operationalization of the right to development. And really our hope is that it would provide some guidance to states, international agencies, and NGOs on how to address these issues.
Excellent, thank you for that. So from what I understand, the study was adopted by the UN Expert Mechanism on November 3rd of this year. So it will now go to the Human Rights Council for review and approval. So if approved by the Council, what do you see as perhaps practical or tangible outcomes of implementing these recommendations provided in the report?
Yeah, so the expert mechanism is a subsidiary body of the United Nations Human Rights Council. So we were set up by the Human Rights Council and we report to the Human Rights Council. So expert mechanism studies typically go to the United Nations Human Rights Council, and in many cases they adopt these or they approve it. And then it becomes an official study of the United Nations. And where it goes from there is that it becomes a resource for the United Nations, UN agencies and bodies, but also state members of the United Nations to draw on their continuing efforts to operationalize the right to development. Significantly, it also becomes an important resource for civil society organizations, NGOs. So there are civil society organizations that have consultative status with the United Nations. And the studies produced by UN expert bodies like ours often become a reference point for them in how they do the work. So our hope is that this study that we've worked on will have far-reaching impact in pushing forward the right to development worldwide.
That's great. So it has the potential to be sort of more publicly accessed and employed around the world.
Exactly.
Do you anticipate any sort of challenges in getting the recommendations perhaps implemented by these various organizations or states?
Yeah, so when studies like these are done, and it does take a lot of time and effort, the study on racism, we worked on for over a year, perhaps even 2 years. And there's always the concern that we put in all this effort into these studies based on empirical research, and they just sit on the shelf and no one uses them. So one of the things we have been doing to address that is to really publicize these studies, to kind of put them out there, put them on the website, engage with NGOs. So one of the things I did while I was in Geneva last month is to have consultative meetings with states and civil society organizations to kind of speak to the report, the study, and some of the key recommendations. And I hope that it will kind of push them to engage more with the study. I do expect that there might be some challenges, and we saw that in the process of writing the report. When you have all the countries in the world represented on an issue, there's bound to be disagreement. So for instance, some delegates in Geneva raised objection to the reference to sexual minority rights as part of the study, just because they argue that these are not rights that have been, enshrined formally in UN documents. But that is to be expected, that there will be such reservations, as they're called in the UN system. But by and large, I am hopeful that many states, international organizations, and civil society actors will find this document useful in how they interpret and implement the right to development.
Absolutely. Yeah, even if not every aspect can be implemented everywhere, perhaps it also helps as a broader lens to approaching the right to development. Yeah. From what I understand, you had a few graduate students work on this report with you. What role do you sort of see for students in engaging with this type of work or pushing this work forward, perhaps on a local or a more global scale?
Yeah, so it was quite gratifying to have students work with me on this project. Very often students write, long research papers. They do all these, basic research, some of it quite in-depth. And, we wonder sometimes, does this have any meaning for, real life, for the lived experiences of ordinary people? So this project really provided an opportunity to engage students, some of whom are already working on this topic or on related topics, to do work that will have potentially important policy impact. So the ground research, the literature review, the policy scans, all that kind of foundational stuff that goes into a comprehensive study like this was undertaken by a research assistant working within the framework of Participedia and other research projects that I'm involved in. So it was really important to see the input of students. And I must say that they brought unique perspectives to the report. Their role wasn't just compiling data and analyzing data. The students actually made substantive suggestions as to how the report should be written, what to include and not include, and how to frame the entire report. So I'm very grateful to the students who worked with me on this report.
That's fantastic. So shifting our focus a little bit to your work with the Global Citizens Assembly and the United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26, from your perspective as a member of the Global Governance and Participation Committee, can you tell us a little bit about the work of Global Citizens Assembly?
Yes, the Global Citizens Assembly, it's a very interesting and novel idea that I'm very proud and honored to be part of. So to understand the novelty and the uniqueness of the Global Assembly, you have to think about conventional notions of global governance. So when we think about global governance, we typically think about international agencies like the UN, the World Health Organization. And then when we think about it in terms of civil society, we think of, the role of international organization. But these standard platforms or forums for global governance often do not represent all the voices, particularly those in marginalized spaces whose voices are often represented either in local deliberative processes, but even less so in global deliberative processes. So what the Global Assembly aims to do is to provide an alternative forum, to model an alternative forum for global governance, one that seeks to capture the voices of people around the world who will typically not be represented in the decision-making process on big global issues such as climate change, health, pandemics, and some of these big questions. So that is what is unique about the Global Citizens Assembly, that we are going a different route. So, many citizens assemblies tend to be top-down, organized by governments to represent citizen voices. We're going in the opposite direction. We are kind of getting citizens involved from the grassroots and giving them an opportunity to have a voice to deliberate on big global questions. The goal is to have about 1 million citizens involved in this process as participants in global assemblies in the next decade or so.
That's great. And so the Assembly presented their People's Declaration for the Sustainable Future of Planet Earth at the 2021 UN Climate Change Conference in November. So what is sort of the significance or value in presenting this declaration from this type of assembly at COP26?
Yeah, it was important because it provided a forum for citizens, ordinary citizens from around the world to have a voice at a forum that is often dominated by international organizations, states, and organized civil society, organized NGOs. But here you had a group of 100 citizens randomly selected from around the world based on our partnership with local grassroots organizations who got a chance to deliberate on some of these key questions and present their views at a forum where it could be captured in a way that might make policy changes. So I think it was significant to have a forum like this at COP26.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's been a lot of criticism generally around COP26 this year in particular, concerns about lack of inclusion in these spaces, lack of action as well. So it's a really interesting way to kind of infiltrate the forum or format using the assembly here. So do you see any other limitations to continuing to have these types of discussions in this format?
So this was the first of a series of global citizens assembly that we plan to have, and as you can expect, there were some teaching challenges, initial challenges. So just to give you an example, questions of translation. If you're getting citizens, 100 citizens from around the world, with various educational backgrounds, speaking various languages, coming with different levels of knowledge about the issues, just bringing everyone to the same place where they can have a meaningful and fruitful conversation was a bit challenging, the process. And you also have to remember we're doing this amidst the COVID pandemic. So it's all virtual, you know, the Citizens Assembly work best in person when people can relate to each other, read each other's body language. That's what research shows. But we had to do this under COVID, so and virtually. So some of these challenges were evident, but there are also challenges that we think we can surmount. And I think these challenges were also evident with the general organization of COP26. But again, I think these are challenges that can ultimately be surmounted.
Absolutely. And our last question here, were there any sort of noteworthy moments, topics, or discussions at either of these two events that you would like to share with those of us not present at these spaces?
Yes, I mean, one of the things that I find most gratifying and frankly inspiring when I engage in these forums, whether it's at the United Nations expert mechanism or with the Global Assembly as COP26, is the significant and enormous amount of work that grassroots organizations are already doing on these issues. It's amazing to see with very little resources how local communities are organizing themselves. And we capture a lot of this on Participedia. You know, you go to Participedia, you see all these wonderful case and method entries of how local people are trying to tackle local issues using local resources, drawing on their strengths, you know, displaying impressive resiliency in how they do this. But it's a different thing to actually see some of these people and hear them and talk with them about how they go about this work that they do. For instance, at COP26, it was interesting to see how, you know, local people were already trying to address, you know, big issues of climate change within the confines of the limited resources and knowledge they have in their communities. So for me, these are the noteworthy moments to know that there is local capacity, there is local interest, and what remains is for us to find a way of leveraging this connection to make big, you know, real-time world impacts.
So that sounds hopeful and also gives us a bit of a action item, perhaps, to figure out ways to leverage all of this work that's already being done in these spaces. Excellent.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much for sitting down and answering these questions and giving us a bit of a glimpse inside these global events. So thank you so much, Dr. Ibhawoh.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.